The city's most dangerous man was about to become its most grieving brother. Elena Russo, sister to the ruthless Viktor Moretti, was slipping away. For 40 agonizing hours, 18 of the world's most elite specialists had poked, prodded, and scanned, but their million-dollar machines were silent. The baby was trapped, and Elena's heart was failing. Viktor Moretti, a man who had never been told no in his life, stood in the corner of the sterile room, his dark eyes burning with a helpless rage that made even the chief of surgery tremble. Then, a junior nurse named Nadia Clark, wearing yellow scrubs stained from a double shift, did the one thing that should have signed her death warrant. She stepped past the wall of Ivy League diplomas, shoved a rolling tray aside, and looked the Mafia boss right in his cold, terrifying eyes. "Your doctors are looking at monitors," she said, her voice steady despite the guns she knew were tucked under the suits behind her. "But I'm looking at your sister. I can save them both." Nadia had no PhD from Yale. She had hands that had spent her childhood helping her mother deliver babies in a mountain town so small it wasn't even on the GPS. She knew a secret the specialists called voodoo, a rhythmic alignment passed down through generations of Appalachian midwives. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his face flushed with professional disgust. "She's a junior nurse. Get her out of here before she kills them both." But Elena reached out, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped Nadia's hand. She saw something the specialists lacked, certainty. "Let her try," Elena gasped. Nadia had exactly 3 minutes. If she failed, she wouldn't just lose her nursing license, she'd face the wrath of the Moretti family. She placed her trembling, calloused hands on Elena's distended belly. What she did in the next 60 seconds would either make her a legend or ensure she was never seen again. If you're ready to see how nobody outsmarted the experts, hit that like button and subscribe. You aren't going to believe what happened when the next contraction hit. Viktor Moretti was a man whose name was whispered in the dark corners of New York like a curse. To the city, he was the king of the underworld, a specter in a tailored black suit who had built an empire on ironclad loyalty and cold-blooded precision. The visible ink on his neck, a dark vine creeping toward his jaw, was a warning to anyone who dared to look him in the eye for too long. He had survived 3 assassination attempts and outlived every rival who had ever crossed him, earning a reputation for being a man without a heart. But as he stood in the sterile, overly bright delivery room of the hospital's private wing, the cold mask was beginning to crack. For the first time in his life, his wealth and his weapons were useless. He couldn't bribe the monitors to stop their frantic beeping, and he couldn't threaten his sister's failing heart into beating stronger. Elena was the only person in the world who didn't fear him. To her, he wasn't the monster that made the docks run red, he was simply Viktor, the older brother who had protected her since they were children in the slums. She was his only tether to humanity, the soft center of his hardened world. Watching her face turn the color of ash as the labor stretched into its second day was a torture more exquisite than any he had ever inflicted on his enemies. Every time Elena let out a ragged, shallow moan, Viktor's hand would twitch toward the holster concealed beneath his jacket. His guards stood at the door, statues of muscle and malice, but Viktor didn't care about the perimeter. He cared about the 18 men and women in white coats who were currently retreating from the bed. These were the kings of medicine, specialists flown in on private jets, yet they were trading panicked glances and shaking their heads. Viktor stepped into the center of the room, the air seemingly dropping 10 degrees as he moved. He leaned over the bed, his shadow falling across Elena's sweat-soaked forehead. He took her hand, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of violence, and held it with a tenderness that would have shocked his associates. "Stay with me, Elle," he rasped, his voice a low growl that vibrated with suppressed terror. "I didn't bring you this far for it to end in a room full of cowards." He looked up at the lead specialist, his gaze sharp enough to draw blood. The doctor stammered something about unforeseen complications and standard protocols, but Viktor wasn't listening to the excuses. He saw the defeat in their eyes. The specialists had already written the death certificate in their minds. To them, Elena was a failed case study, to Viktor, she was the entire world. He was a king with no power, a predator with no prey, waiting for a miracle he didn't believe in, until a flash of yellow scrubs caught the corner of his eye. Nadia Clark wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of a latex glove, the movement mechanical and weary. She had been on her feet for 16 hours, transitioning straight from a grueling graveyard shift into this high-stakes nightmare. Her yellow scrubs, once a bright, cheerful cotton, were now a map of her exhaustion, spattered with the chemical scent of industrial disinfectant and stained with a dark blotch of spilled coffee she'd had no time to change. In this room of pristine white silk ties and starched laboratory coats that crinkled with the sound of money, Nadia looked like a smudge on a masterpiece. She stood by the supply cart, a ghost in the machinery of the hospital. For months, she had moved through these halls like a shadow, ignored by the very specialists who now stood paralyzed by indecision. She was the one who changed the soiled linens while they discussed fetal anomalies, in hushed, arrogant tones. She was the one who held the hands of terrified mothers in the middle of the night while the surgeons slept in their suburban mansions. To Dr. Hayes and Dr. Shah, she wasn't a peer, she was part of the furniture, a background character in their grand professional dramas. But as she watched the monitors flicker with the erratic heartbeat of the Russo baby, Nadia felt a familiar, ancestral hum beneath her skin. This wasn't something she'd learned in a sterile lecture hall at an Ivy League university. It was a visceral memory of her mother's kitchen in the Appalachian foothills, where the air smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. She remembered watching her mother's weathered hands move over a neighbor's belly with a rhythmic, almost musical certainty, a technique passed down through a lineage of women who didn't need ultrasounds to know when a life was snagged. Nadia had spent years trying to bury that part of herself, desperate to fit into the rigid, logical world of modern medicine. She had allowed herself to be silenced by the weight of their degrees and the sharpness of their condescension. But today, the silence was suffocating. Every time Dr. Hayes checked his luxury watch, he was counting down the seconds of Elena's life. The specialists were ready to cut, to force, to invade, to use the only tools their expensive education had given them. Nadia looked at her own hands, calloused and sore from a double shift of manual labor. They were the hands of a servant in the eyes of the elite, but they carried a 7-generation legacy of the knowing. She knew exactly why the baby was stuck, and she knew that a scalpel would be a death sentence. The fear that had kept her invisible for years was suddenly eclipsed by a jagged, righteous spark of anger. She wasn't just a nurse in stained scrubs anymore, she was the only person in the room who wasn't afraid to listen to what the body was saying. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic, taunting beep of the fetal heart monitor, a sound that was slowing with every passing minute. Dr. Hayes, the man whose hands were insured for millions, finally stepped back from the bedside. He didn't look at Elena. He looked at his watch, then at the other 17 specialists, seeking the safety of a consensus. With a heavy sigh that sounded more like a legal disclaimer than a gesture of grief, he turned toward Viktor Moretti. "Mr. Moretti," Hayes began, his voice thin and clinical. "We have exhausted every protocol known to modern obstetrics. The baby is in a transverse lie, locked against the pelvic brim. Emergency surgery is the only path left, but in your sister's current state of shock, the odds of either of them surviving the table are less than 5%. We have to face the inevitable. We are losing them." The words hung in the air like a death warrant. For a heartbeat, the room was so still it felt as though time itself had frozen. Then, the explosion came. Viktor didn't shout, he didn't need to. He moved with the sudden, predatory grace of a viper, his hand closing around the lapels of Dr. Hayes's pristine white coat and slamming the man against the marble wall. The sound of the impact echoed like a gunshot. "Inevitable." Viktor's voice was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to rattle the surgical equipment. "I paid for the best. I flew you here because you told me you were gods. And now you stand here and tell me my sister is a statistic?" His bodyguards moved in unison, their hands disappearing beneath their jackets, their eyes fixed on the remaining 17 doctors who scrambled backward in a wave of white fabric. Dr. Priya Shah let out a muffled gasp of terror, her hands trembling as she clutched a tablet that was now useless. The kings of medicine were suddenly just men in a room with a monster. If she dies, Viktor hissed, his face inches from the pale, sweating forehead of Dr. Hayes, this room becomes your tomb. I will not leave this floor without my sister and my nephew. Do you understand me? Find a way, or I will find someone else to fill your shoes after I'm done with you. The specialists were paralyzed, trapped between a medical impossibility and a lethal threat. They had the degrees, the technology, and the ego, but they had no answers. It was in this moment of absolute, terrifying deadlock that the small, stained figure in yellow scrubs stepped out from the shadows of the supply cart. Nadia Clark didn't look at the guns or the shaking doctors. She looked at the woman dying on the bed, and she realized that the inevitable was only a lack of imagination. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the air. Nadia stepped forward, her footsteps silent on the polished marble floors. She didn't look at the gun-toting guards or the sweating, pinned chief of surgery. She kept her eyes locked on the monitor, where the baby's heart rate was a stuttering, dying rhythm. You're trying to force the lock, Nadia's voice cut through the chaos, quiet but ringing with an authority that didn't belong to a junior nurse. But the baby isn't a door you can just kick down. He's tilted, his shoulder caught behind the pubic bone. If you cut her now, the hemorrhage will take her before you even see his face. Viktor released Dr. Hayes, who slumped against the wall, gasping for air. The Mafia boss turned his predatory gaze toward Nadia, his eyes narrowing as he took in her stained yellow scrubs and the trembling of her hands, not from fear, but from the raw energy of what she was about to propose. And you think you know better than 18 specialists, he growled, his voice a low warning. I know what I've seen, Nadia countered, stepping to the side of the bed. In the mountains, we call it the Appalachian Turn. My mother delivered hundreds of babies this way when the nearest hospital was 4 hours away. It's not about strength, and it's not about surgery. It's about a specific, rhythmic counterpressure that mimics the mother's natural internal flow to gently guide the child into the light. Dr. Priya Shah let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. The Appalachian Turn. This is a hospital, not a backwoods cabin. What you're describing is unscientific, dangerous, and frankly, it sounds like voodoo. We use Leopold's maneuver for positioning, and even that has failed here. You're talking about manipulating a distressed fetus with nothing but your bare hands. It's barbaric. It's not voodoo, doctor, Nadia snapped, her eyes flashing. It's a 7th-generation understanding of anatomy that your textbooks haven't caught up to yet. You call it a distressed fetus. I call it a baby who is trying to tell us he's stuck. He's resting, waiting for someone to help him pivot. Every second you spend arguing about my credentials, his heart beats 1 time less. The doctors began to murmur, a collective wave of indignation rising against the peasant in their midst. They spoke of malpractice, of licenses, of the primitive nature of folk medicine. But Viktor Moretti wasn't listening to them anymore. He was watching the way Nadia looked at Elena, not as a case study, but as a person. He saw that knowing, in her eyes, a reflection of the same primal survival instinct that had built his own empire. The air in the delivery room was so thick with adrenaline and dread that it felt as though the oxygen had been replaced by a heavy, metallic fog. Viktor Moretti stood at the center of the storm, his chest heaving under his black suit jacket, his hands still twitching near the holster at his waist. He looked at the 18 specialists, their faces pale and their eyes darting toward the exits, and then he looked at Nadia. She stood at the foot of the bed, a small, weary figure in stained yellow scrubs, but she didn't flinch. While the doctors saw a liability, Nadia saw a life. Viktor stepped closer to her, his shadow swallowing her light. He was used to reading men's souls in their eyes, looking for the flicker of a lie or the tremor of a coward. He reached out, his hand closing around Nadia's upper arm with a grip that was meant to intimidate, meant to remind her that he could end her story with a single word. If you touch her and fail, Viktor rasped, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver through the room, you will never walk out of this hospital. You understand that, nurse? Nadia didn't blink. She looked up at him, her gaze as sharp and steady as a mountain ridge. I understand that if I don't touch her, she's already gone. You're a man who respects results, Mr. Moretti. Give me 5 minutes, and I'll give you your family. A wave of panicked murmurs erupted from the wall of white coats. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his hands raised in protest. Viktor, this is insanity. You're letting a girl who cleans up after us perform a procedure we haven't even vetted. It's a breach of every hospital protocol. If anything happens, the legal ramifications. Viktor spun on his heel, his eyes flashing with a sudden, lethal brightness that silenced Hayes mid-sentence. Protocol. Viktor spat the word like it was poison. Your protocol is death. Your protocol is excuses. I'm done with your diplomas. He turned back to his men, his voice cracking like a whip. Clear them back. Anyone who interferes with her gets a permanent vacation. The bodyguards moved instantly, their massive frames forming a human barricade between the specialists and the bed. Dr. Shah and Dr. Hayes were pushed back, their faces twisted in a mixture of outrage and terror as they watched the hierarchy of the hospital crumble in real time. Viktor looked back at Nadia and gave a single, curt nod. The choice was made. He stepped back, his hand falling away from her arm, leaving the space around the bed empty. For the first time in 40 hours, the machines weren't the focus. Every eye in the room was on Nadia's calloused, soap-scented hands as she reached out toward Elena's abdomen. The room fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the sweat hit the floor. I've got you, Nadia whispered to Elena, her voice the only gentle thing in the room. We're going to bring him home. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a clinical crisis to a theater of the absurd. Behind the living wall of Viktor's bodyguards, the 18 specialists huddled together, their faces a mask of indignation and wounded pride. Dr. Hayes adjusted his silk tie, his chest heaving with a mixture of fear and professional fury. To him, the sight of Nadia standing over the patient was a personal insult, a desecration of the millions of dollars spent on his education. Look at this, Hayes whispered, loud enough for the other doctors to hear but low enough to avoid the guards' notice. She's not even checking the monitor. She's going to cost us 2 lives because of some mountain superstition. Dr. Shah nodded, her eyes narrowed in a cold, calculating gaze as she watched Nadia's hands begin to move. Nadia wasn't using a cold, metal instrument or an ultrasound probe, she was using her palms to feel the tension in the uterine wall, her fingers tracing the baby's spine through the skin. She began a slow, rhythmic rocking motion, a strange, circular pressure that looked more like a ritual than a medical procedure. It's barbaric, Shah muttered, a sneer curling her lip. It's practically medieval. We have the most advanced imaging technology in the world, and she's treating a high-risk delivery like she's kneading bread. It's unscientific. It's voodoo. The gallery of scorn grew more vocal as they watched Nadia close her eyes, her head tilted as if she were listening to a sound only she could hear. One specialist shook his head in a slow, theatrical display of disappointment. Another folded his arms, leaning back as if waiting for the inevitable disaster so he could say, "I told you so." They traded glances of shared superiority, mocking the way her stained yellow scrub stood out against the high-tech equipment. She's touching the fundus at the wrong angle, Hayes hissed to a colleague. She's going to cause a placental abruption. Any second now, those alarms are going to flatline, and it'll be on her head. This is what happens when you let the cleaning staff play God. But Nadia remained a pillar of stillness amidst their whispers. She didn't defend her voodoo or explain the physics of the counterpressure she was applying. To her, the doctors weren't experts, they were just background noise, a swarm of insects buzzing around a dying flame. She could feel the baby's shoulder hooked firmly against the bone, a physical puzzle that required a soft touch, not a sharp blade. Every mocking laugh from the sidelines only steeled her resolve. She knew that while they were looking at their lost reputations, she was the only one in the room actually looking at the child. The air in the room suddenly sharpened as Elena's body arched, her back straining against the hospital bed in the grip of a violent contraction. The monitors erupted into a cacophony of shrill alarms as the baby's heart rate plummeted into the danger zone. "Now," Nadia whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. She didn't move like a surgeon, she moved like a storm chaser. Instead of standing back, she leaned her entire weight into the bed, her hands diving deep into the soft tissue of Elena's abdomen. But she wasn't just pressing. She began a series of sharp, jarring movements, a forceful, rhythmic rocking that looked more like a struggle than a medical procedure. To the onlookers, it appeared as though she were trying to break the very woman she claimed to be saving. "Stop her!" Dr. Hayes screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. "She's going to rupture the uterus. She's killing them." Dr. Shah and two other specialists broke ranks, charging toward the bed. "This is assault. Get your hands off her!" Shah cried, reaching out to grab Nadia's shoulder. But they never made it. With a sound like a whip cracking, Viktor Moretti's hand slammed against the bed rail, blocking their path. His eyes never left Nadia, but his voice was a lethal snarl directed at the doctors. "Touch her, and you die where you stand." The doctors recoiled, frozen by the raw violence in Viktor's tone, but their eyes remained fixed on the bed in horror. Nadia was now using her forearms, applying a counter-rotational pressure that forced Elena to let out a guttural, soul-wrenching scream. It looked brutal. It looked wrong. It looked like the desperate act of someone who had lost their mind. Elena's fingernails raked the sheets, and her eyes rolled back in her head. "She's causing a fatal hemorrhage." Hayes yelled from behind the guard's arm. "Look at the monitor. The pressure is too high." Nadia ignored them. She could feel it, the subtle shift of bone against bone, the moment the baby's shoulder finally slid beneath the pelvic brim. It wasn't a medical click, it was a release of tension that only someone with 7 generations of mountain blood could detect. She felt the baby's head rotate, pivoting into the birth canal like a key finally finding its lock. Almost there, Nadia panted, her yellow scrubs now soaked through with her own sweat and the spray of broken water. She gave one final, decisive thrust, her hands guiding the unseen life with a certainty that defied every textbook in the room. Suddenly, the room went silent. The frantic, high-pitched beeping of the distress alarm stopped. For a second, Dr. Hayes opened his mouth to declare the time of death, his face twisted in a "told you so" sneer. But then, the monitor began a new rhythm. A steady, slow, and powerful thump-thump. Thump-thump. The baby had turned. The heavy, metallic scent of the room seemed to vanish as a new sound cut through the oppressive hum of the million-dollar equipment. It wasn't the rhythmic chime of a computer or the frantic shouting of a doctor. It was a raw, jagged, and beautiful wail, the sound of a pair of lungs tasting the air for the very first time. The silence that followed the baby's first cry was absolute. It was a silence of total, unadulterated shock. Dr. Hayes stood with his mouth slightly open, his hands still raised as if to stop a disaster that had instead turned into a miracle. Beside him, Dr. Shah stared at the monitors, her eyes wide as she watched the once flatlining numbers surge back to life. The inevitable tragedy they had all predicted had been dismantled by a woman they hadn't even bothered to learn the name of. Nadia didn't look up to enjoy their stunned expressions. Her hands, still trembling from the intensity of the Appalachian Turn, were busy cradling the small, slick form of the Moretti heir. She wiped the newborn's face with a gentle, practiced precision, her movements as steady as the mountains she came from. The baby's skin, once a terrifying shade of blue, was rapidly flushing with a healthy, vibrant pink. Viktor Moretti took a step forward, his heavy boots echoing like thunder in the quiet room. The man who made the city tremble was now shaking. He looked down at the tiny life in Nadia's arms, then at his sister Elena, who had collapsed back against the pillows, her eyes wet with tears of pure exhaustion and relief. For the first time, the predatory hardness in Viktor's face vanished, replaced by a look of profound, humbled awe. The 18 specialists remained frozen, a gallery of defeated egos. They looked from their high-tech ultrasound machines, which had told them the baby was stuck, to Nadia's calloused hands, which had proven them wrong. No one spoke. There were no academic papers to explain what they had just witnessed, no medical journals that covered the voodoo that had just saved the most powerful family in the city. Nadia carefully wrapped the infant in a warm blanket and leaned down, placing him against Elena's chest. "He's a fighter," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. She stood up and finally looked at the wall of white coats. She didn't need to say a word. Her stained yellow scrubs, drenched in the labor of a life saved, spoke louder than any diploma ever could. The invisible nurse had just done the unthinkable, and the smartest people in the room were left with nothing but the echoes of a baby's scream and the weight of their own silence. The chaos of the morning had settled into a heavy, reverent stillness. The 18 specialists had retreated like beaten ghosts, their polished shoes clicking quietly down the hall as they fled the scene of their own obsolescence. Elena was asleep, her face finally peaceful, with the small, warm weight of her son tucked against her side. Viktor Moretti remained by the window, the morning sun catching the dark ink on his neck. He turned as Nadia began to gather her things, his presence still commanding, but the lethal edge had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a debt of honor. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. To anyone else, he was a monster. To Nadia, in this moment, he was simply a man who had been given back his world. "You saved my blood," Viktor said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "While those men were measuring their egos, you were doing the impossible. The Moretti family does not forget. I don't care about your lack of a degree or the dirt on your scrubs. Name your price. Money, a house, a new life in a city where no one knows your name. It's yours." Nadia looked down at her hands, the hands of a midwife's daughter, still smelling of the hospital soap and the raw miracle of birth. She thought of the years spent being invisible, of the double shifts and the condescending sneers of men like Dr. Hayes. She didn't want a mansion, and she didn't want to run. "I don't want your money, Mr. Moretti," Nadia said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I want to keep doing exactly what I was born to do. I want to stay here. But I won't work in the shadows anymore. I want to be a nurse who isn't afraid to speak up when the experts are wrong. I want this hospital to be a place where the patient matters more than the diploma." Viktor's lips thinned into the ghost of a smile, an expression that would have terrified his enemies, but felt like a shield to Nadia. "You want to change the system from the inside? That's a war, Nadia. But it's a war you won't fight alone." He stepped back and looked at his lead bodyguard, then toward the hospital administrator who was hovering nervously in the doorway. "From this moment on," Viktor announced, his voice carrying the weight of a decree, "this wing, and this nurse, are under my personal protection. If anyone questions her methods, if anyone threatens her license, or if anyone so much as looks at her with disrespect, they deal with me. This hospital now answers to a different kind of authority." Nadia adjusted her stained yellow scrubs, feeling the weight of her invisibility lift forever. She wasn't just a nurse anymore, she was the conscience of the building, backed by the most formidable force in the city. As she walked out of the room to finally end her shift, she didn't look like a poor nurse anymore. She looked like a queen reclaiming her throne. For the first time in generations, the mountain's secrets were no longer hidden, they were the law. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family strength, a life full of joy and peace every day. See you again in the next video.